He felt as insignificant as the dust he swept each day. In the dimly lit hallway of the Texas Veterans Museum, an elderly janitor quietly pushed his mop across the marble floor. People passed by without so much as a nod in his direction. To them, he was just part of the scenery, a bent old man in a faded uniform, nearly invisible. But that night, during a special ceremony, something happened that no one expected. The crowd's attention, which had been fixed on a visiting four-star general, suddenly shifted. Every eye turned to the janitor they had ignored just moments before. General Marcus Wilson had marched into the hall with a confident stride, his chest full of medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He barely noticed the janitor in the corner at first. No one did. But as the general reached the center of the hall, he caught sight of the old man with the mop. The general's steps slowed. A flash of recognition crossed his face, as if he were staring at a ghost from long ago. Murmurs rippled through the crowd when the decorated officer abruptly stopped. A hush fell over the hall. The janitor, Ethan Thompson, froze in place. Did the general just recognize him? His heart pounded in his chest. General Wilson stood taller, and with a deliberate motion brought his right hand up in a crisp salute. And he was saluting the janitor. Ethan's mouth fell open. A stunned silence gripped the room as dozens of uniformed soldiers behind the general snapped to attention, following their commander's lead. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The same janitor who had been invisible seconds ago now stood as the center of attention, receiving a salute of honor from one of the nation's highest-ranking officers. Ethan's weathered hand trembled on the mop handle, his eyes wide with disbelief and emotion. How could this be happening? He had spent years believing that the world had forgotten him, that his heroics were buried in the past. Yet here he was, being recognized in the most unbelievable way. General Wilson's eyes glistened with respect and gratitude. Ethan felt a lump in his throat as memories from decades ago flooded his mind. As the general's salute held steady, Ethan slowly straightened his posture. Tears that he had held back for years now pricked at the corners of his eyes. It was as if all the loneliness and invisibility of his later years were washing away under the bright gaze of honor. The entire hall remained spellbound, waiting for an explanation for this extraordinary moment. Ethan's lips quivered, but he didn't speak. In the silence, the weight of unspoken stories hung heavily in the air. The old janitor's hidden past was about to come crashing into the present in front of everyone. If you also believe that unsung heroes deserve to be honored, stand with us now. The morning sun peeked over the quiet streets of Red Oak, Texas, as Ethan Thompson prepared for another day at the Veterans Museum. The small town slowly came to life around him. A nod from the diner owner as Ethan passed by, a wave from a neighbor walking her dog. Everyone knew him as the polite old janitor who kept the museum spotless. They saw his gentle smile and stooped posture, but none of them knew the weight he carried in his past. In this peaceful community, Ethan was liked but largely unseen, his history tucked away like an old war medal in a drawer. At the museum, Ethan slipped on his navy blue custodial uniform and pushed his cleaning cart down the familiar halls. The building was still quiet before opening. He moved slowly, favoring a bad knee that ached more on chilly mornings, a souvenir from a lifetime ago in the jungles of Vietnam. As he polished a glass case displaying a tattered American flag, Ethan's reflection stared back at him. He recalled the young soldier he once was, brave, scared, and full of camaraderie. A faint sigh escaped his lips. He never talked about his service. The memories were too personal, too painful. Besides, who would believe that the quiet janitor had once run through enemy fire to save his brothers in arms? By noon, the museum buzzed with activity. An important ceremony was scheduled for that evening, and staff hurried to prepare. The local news had announced that a highly decorated retired general would be visiting to dedicate a new Vietnam War exhibit. Ethan had seen the name on the event poster: General Marcus A. Wilson. The name tugged at something in his memory. Could it be the same Marcus Wilson he'd known in Vietnam back in 1968? Ethan shook his head, dismissing the idea as coincidence. There were many Wilsons in the world, and decades had passed. He doubted a famous general would remember a lowly corporal from so long ago, if they were even the same people. "Ethan, make sure the stage area is spotless. The general will stand right here for his speech," the museum's event coordinator, Molly, instructed briskly. She was a young woman, eager to impress the VIP guest. Ethan nodded and quietly went to fetch his mop and bucket. As he returned, Molly glanced at his worn uniform and hesitated. "Oh, and Ethan," she added in a gentler tone, "once you're done, could you maybe stay behind the scenes during the ceremony? We want everything to look perfect for the cameras." Her forced smile barely masked the dismissiveness of the request. Ethan simply lowered his eyes and assured her he'd keep out of the way. He was used to being in the background. That was his job, after all. Still, as he walked away, a familiar pang of isolation tugged at his heart. That afternoon, the museum opened its doors to local attendees and visiting military personnel. Ethan quietly slipped between exhibits, tidying up brochures and emptying trash bins while guests filtered in. A group of young soldiers laughed and chatted near the entrance, barely noticing the old man who stepped aside to let them pass. Ethan managed a polite smile, but inside he felt a mix of pride and longing. He saw their crisp uniforms and straight postures and remembered when he stood just like that, decades younger and full of purpose. Now he was just the janitor to them. As one soldier inadvertently bumped his cleaning cart without apology, Ethan steadied it and sighed. It was as if the universe itself was reminding him of his place. Despite trying to keep a low profile, Ethan couldn't resist pausing by the new Vietnam exhibit before the event began. The centerpiece was a list of names etched in a bronze plaque: locals who had served and those who never came home. Ethan's eyes drifted to a familiar name: Private Samuel Ortiz, his best friend, who died in his arms in Hugh City, 1968. He felt a tightness in his chest and reached out to touch the engraved letters gently. "I'm still here, Sam," he whispered under his breath, voice trembling. "I never forget." He blinked away the beginning of tears and straightened up, his janitor's cap casting a shadow over his determined eyes. No one else saw this moment of vulnerability. Ethan swallowed hard, reminded himself that tonight was just another event. He would stay unseen, pay his respects from afar, and life would go on as usual. Little did he know, fate was quietly steering him toward a moment he never imagined possible. All the years of being overlooked were about to end in the most dramatic fashion. The humble janitor was on the verge of becoming the unwitting centerpiece of the very ceremony he was hired to clean up after. Do you know an unsung hero in your life? As evening settled in, the museum's main hall filled with rows of folding chairs and hushed anticipation. Uniformed soldiers from the nearby base stood in neat formation alongside townspeople and veterans. An American flag draped across the podium where the guest of honor would speak. Ethan hovered at the back of the hall, half hidden behind a display of a Vietnam-era helicopter. He had traded his mop for a quieter task, adjusting chairs and picking up stray programs left on seats. Keeping busy helped calm his nerves. He reminded himself to stay inconspicuous, as Molly had asked. Still, his heart thudded with a mix of anxiety and curiosity. Through a gap between the exhibits, he caught a glimpse of the arriving dignitaries. When General Marcus Wilson entered in full uniform, the crowd rose instinctively to their feet, applause rippling through the hall. Ethan felt a jolt of recognition and clutched the back of a chair to steady himself. It was him, the same Marcus Wilson from all those years ago. Older, grayer, but undoubtedly the man he had pulled out of the line of fire in Vietnam. Ethan's mind swirled with memories, but he quickly ducked his head, hoping to remain unseen. General Wilson took his seat at the front, but he appeared distracted. As the museum director welcomed everyone and introduced the keynote speaker, Marcus Wilson's gaze wandered. He scanned the hall with a furrowed brow, as if searching for something or someone. In his mind, the general was already piecing together a puzzle, the familiar name he'd glimpsed on a staff roster, the brief sighting of an elderly custodian as he walked in. Could it really be the same Ethan Thompson who saved my life? He wondered. The possibility tugged at his heart. He remembered a young corporal's face lit by flares on a dark night in Hue, and the echo of that name, Thompson, shouting over the gunfire. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. When it was time for General Wilson to speak, he approached the podium to a round of respectful applause. Ethan stood at the very back, partially obscured by shadows, but he couldn't resist looking on. The general began his speech in a steady, authoritative voice. He spoke about the bravery of those who served in Vietnam, the importance of remembering their sacrifices, and the dedication of communities like Red Oak in honoring veterans. Ethan listened intently, one calloused hand resting on the helicopter exhibit beside him. Each word of tribute resonated deeply, almost painfully, in his chest. It was as if General Wilson were speaking directly to the ghosts of their shared past. Halfway through his speech, General Wilson's eyes drifted beyond the bright stage lights to the dim edges of the room. And then he saw him. At first, it was just a silhouette by the helicopter display, an old man standing very still. But a shaft of light from the exit sign caught the janitor's face for an instant. Marcus Wilson's breath caught in his throat mid-sentence. Those eyes, he thought. I know those eyes. In that fleeting moment, the general's mind snapped back in time. Flashback. Vietnam, 1968. Gunfire cracked through the thick night air of Hue City. Young Lieutenant Marcus Wilson lay wounded behind a crumbling wall, the sky flickering orange with explosions. Blood seeped from his leg as enemy fire pinned down his unit. Chaos reigned. Soldiers shouted. Tracers streaked by. The thump of mortars shook the ground. Amidst the panic, a figure emerged from the smoke. Corporal Ethan Thompson, then a sturdy 25-year-old with determined eyes. "I've got you," Ethan shouted over the cacophony, hoisting the injured lieutenant onto his shoulder. With bullets whizzing past, Ethan carried Marcus through mud and rubble toward safety. Marcus remembered looking up at his savior's face, smeared with dirt and etched with resolve, as a helicopter's searchlight caught them. Ethan refused to leave him behind, even as shrapnel tore into Ethan's own leg. The last thing Marcus recalled before blacking out was Ethan's grip tightening, dragging them both behind a tank for cover. End flashback. General Wilson's voice faltered. The audience shifted, confused by the sudden pause. Marcus blinked away the vivid memory and stared again into the back of the hall, at that face in the shadows. "Ethan," he whispered under his breath, scarcely believing it. Ignoring the curious murmurs from the crowd, the general stepped away from the podium. A few of his aides exchanged alarmed glances, unsure what he was doing. Marcus walked slowly, deliberately, off the stage and down the center aisle between the chairs. His eyes were locked on the back of the hall. Ethan's heart nearly stopped when he realized the general was coming toward him. Instinctively, he took a step back, bumping into the helicopter display behind him. He felt like a deer caught in headlights. Every fiber of his being wanted to flee, but his legs refused to move. He had spent decades keeping his head down, but there was no hiding now. not under the unwavering gaze of General Wilson. By now, all conversation in the hall had died down. Every attendee craned their neck to see why the esteemed guest was walking away from the stage. Molly's hand flew to her mouth in shock as she realized the general's destination was her janitor. Whispers rippled through the audience as General Wilson finally stopped a few paces in front of Ethan. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other. Ethan's face was partially in shadow, his expression a mix of awe and apprehension. General Wilson's eyes were bright, filled with recognition and gratitude. In a clear but gentle voice, audible to everyone, he called out, "Corporal Ethan Thompson, is that you?" A gasp broke the silence. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. He managed a shaky nod, his throat too tight to speak. It felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this single moment between them. Marcus Wilson took one step closer, eyes misting. "I never thought I'd see you again," the general said softly, just for Ethan to hear. Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, and he had to blink rapidly to keep them from falling. "It's me, sir," he finally choked out in a hoarse whisper. In that instant, decades of time and a lifetime of silence melted away. They were no longer a general and a janitor standing in a museum hall. They were two soldiers who had shared the crucible of war. The hall was utterly still, charged with anticipation and emotion. Everyone waited, breathless, to see what would happen next. Ethan could feel hundreds of eyes on him, and his knees threatened to give out under the weight of the moment. If you believe that true heroes should finally get the respect they have earned, then you understand what comes next. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Then General Marcus Wilson took a step back and drew himself up to his full height. In one fluid motion, he raised his right hand to his brow in a sharp, respectful salute. It was clear to all that the four-star general was saluting the janitor. Gasps and murmurs swept through the hall, but they quickly gave way to awed silence. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He had never expected to be saluted again in his life, let alone by the very man whose life he had saved. Ethan stood as tall as his aging body allowed and, after a stunned second, managed to return the salute. His hand quivered at his forehead in a gesture he hadn't made in decades. A tear rolled down his cheek as he held it, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. General Wilson's voice rang out, strong and clear. "Present arms," he commanded. In perfect unison, the uniformed soldiers in attendance snapped to attention and raised their hands in salute, their faces a mix of pride and wonder. The audience looked on, many with tears in their eyes, at the sight of a humble janitor being honored like a decorated hero. The general dropped his salute and stepped forward to clasp Ethan's shoulder firmly. Turning to the crowd, General Wilson spoke so that all could hear. "This man," he announced, his voice echoing, "is Corporal Ethan Thompson, the soldier who saved my life and the lives of several others one fateful night in Vietnam." A collective murmur rustled through the crowd as people absorbed his words. Molly's eyes widened. She covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. General Wilson continued, his tone ringing with pride. For decades, he chose to live in quiet humility, never telling anyone what he did. But it's time you all know that you have a hero among you. He glanced around at the townspeople, the museum staff, and the young soldiers in the hall. Corporal Thompson carried wounded men to safety under heavy fire without any regard for his own life. He never sought recognition or reward. I am standing here today because of him. The general paused, his own voice catching for a moment. Tonight, I salute him not as a janitor, but as the bravest soldier I've ever known. At those words, the hall erupted into applause. It started with a few veterans clapping in the front row, then spread until everyone was on their feet. The ovation thundered against the museum's walls. Ethan, overwhelmed, lowered his trembling hand and looked around in disbelief. The same people who had passed by him just hours before were now cheering and weeping for him. One young soldier broke away from the formation and approached Ethan with respect. The soldier stood at attention, then offered his hand earnestly. "Thank you for your service, sir," he said, voice reverent. Ethan reached out and shook the young man's hand, his own weathered face breaking into a humble, grateful smile. Molly stepped forward as well, her earlier briskness gone. Her cheeks were wet with tears. "Mr. Thompson," she managed to say softly, I had no idea. Please forgive me for how I treated you earlier, and thank you, truly, for everything." Ethan simply nodded to her, eyes kind and forgiving. There was no resentment in his heart, only relief and joy that the truth was finally known. In that moment, any loneliness or shame he once felt was washed away by the respect and admiration filling the room. As the applause eventually subsided, General Wilson gently guided Ethan toward the front near the podium. "You deserve to stand up here," the general said warmly. Side by side, they faced the crowd together. Camera flashes lit up the scene, the local press capturing the extraordinary reunion of a janitor and a general, two war veterans bound by an untold act of heroism. Ethan stood with tears drying on his cheeks and a new lightness in his heart. He felt the presence of his fallen comrades in the room, as if they too shared in this moment of honor. Ethan turned to General Wilson and mustered a few words, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, sir, for remembering me," he said quietly. "I was just doing my duty." The general shook his head and offered a gentle smile. "You did far more than that, Ethan." Then, to the delight of everyone watching, the general pulled Ethan into a firm, brotherly hug. A hush fell over the crowd at this touching display. Many wiped their eyes, deeply moved by the bond between the two men. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the museum grew quiet, Ethan remained for a moment in the hall. He wandered over to the Vietnam exhibit, the bronze plaque of names softly illuminated by a single light. His eyes found the name of Samuel Ortiz, the friend he had lost in Hue. Ethan reached out and touched the engraved letters gently. "We did it, Sam," he whispered, voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and relief. In that moment, the burden of silence he had carried for so many years finally felt lighter. In the days that followed, news of the general's salute spread through Red Oak. The local newspaper ran the story of the janitor turned hero on its front page, and neighbors and strangers alike began dropping by the museum to shake Ethan's hand. The museum director even hung a photo from that night near the front desk, a shot of General Wilson saluting Ethan, captioned with "Honoring our local hero." Ethan accepted the attention with humble gratitude, never bragging about his deeds. Perhaps the biggest change was within Ethan himself. Each morning, on his walk to work, he no longer felt invisible. Folks at the diner greeted him warmly, and young soldiers from the base came to hear his stories from the war. With every handshake and heartfelt thank you he received, the ache of his long loneliness grew a little lighter. One afternoon, Ethan paused at the lobby's memorial wall, the one he had tended to for years. He gently ran his fingers over the engraved names of his fallen comrades, and then caught his own reflection in the polished marble. He realized that at last he had fulfilled his quiet promise, to live in a way that honored those who didn't make it home. A gentle sense of pride and peace washed over him as he whispered a silent thank you. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones we walk past every day without a second glance. Ethan's story is a testament to the truth that respect and honor will find those who truly deserve it, even if they aren't seeking the spotlight. In the end, no good deed and no act of courage, no true hero, stays forgotten forever.